Hello, and welcome to F1 Into the Barrier with me, George Close, reviewing the British Grand Prix. And my God, it was a good weekend, and the championship battle, particularly the Constructors, is heating up. And I think what is so interesting, which this weekend shows, is the importance of reliability. And at the rate the Mercedes are getting through the engines, we may well see them facing engine penalties later on this season, which will bring that battle even closer. And ultimately, coming away from the weekend, Ferrari are going to be happy. They got Charles Leclerc the win on the Sunday. Lewis Hamilton managed to take the surprise sprint pole on the Friday. And whilst Mercedes still look to be having the strongest car, little things are starting to go wrong, and that momentum is starting to change. The championship in the drivers is also closing, and we're seeing this battle now. Kimi Antonelli trying to hold on. Maybe the bit of misfortune's going his way now after going George Russell's way earlier in the season, and it's starting to equalise. And we've got more races, and we've got plenty more points to be earned, and it is super, super exciting. So let's take a quick recap of the weekend, a sprint weekend. So yes, the standout from sprint quali, Lewis Hamilton sets up the car wheel and gets pole position. But in the sprint race itself, we see that Kimi Antonelli, whilst he could be within a second behind the Ferrari, ultimately that power boost was enough. There's enough of a delta between the car and a long track like Silverstone to see the Mercedes get the performance. And interesting, before the issue on Sunday, Antonelli was starting to gain on Charles Leclerc, and a graphic went up that he was going to catch him within 3 laps. So it does look as if Mercedes are on the front foot with pace still at the moment, but it's getting closer. It comes to qualifying then on the Saturday. And what we see is Kimi Antonelli be able to put it on pole. He's done it many times this season, and he does it again. And Charles Leclerc, who seems to be getting more confident in the car, apparently because he was taking more wing on the front compared to Lewis over the weekend, he manages to pit Lewis, gets second, and Lewis gets third. And that sets up the Sunday. Now let's get into the race. So Charles Leclerc manages to get a brilliant start and jumps Kimi Antonelli. And he goes off, and largely from there, he does everything he needs to do. And I think a driver of the day. Yes, he got a bit lucky when Kimi Antonelli had his wing shield problem. It looked like he was closing on him, but ultimately he did everything. He managed the pace, he was quick, and Ferrari got the strategy right. And it was a big personal deal for him. There'd been a lot of chat about momentum of Lewis because he got his first win, and that was huge. But now Ferrari have got 2 wins this season, 1 to each driver, and it really sets a tone for him that he is still here. He is still a long way off, but can he force himself back into the championship conversation? He's certainly helping Ferrari force the issue in the Constructors. Now, behind him, Lewis Hamilton also got a good start, maybe slightly too good. He took a 5-second time penalty. Now, why was that? Actually, it's because he moved slightly on the third red light, but stopped. Now, the movement was very small. Ferrari tried to contest it, but apparently relative to Piastri's pit board, you could see a bit of movement on the video, so a slam dunk penalty. Now, he did manage to jump Kimi Antonelli, though. Not the first time Kimi Antonelli's been jumped this season. And ultimately, again, we saw that resolving itself where Kimi Antonelli, with the boost, gets past. Basically identical to the sprint race. They raced each other well, but he gets the position. Lewis Hamilton pits a little bit too early, in his opinion, while he still thought the tyres was good, and he ultimately comes out behind George Russell and a Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen had pitted early. Max Verstappen had got past Isaac Hadjar, who interestingly outqualified Max Verstappen, but very quickly in the race that was righted. And George and Lewis start to battle. Now that battle takes some time, gives Verstappen some breathing room, but ultimately, George stays out in front until he gets his slow right rear puncture. He still battles Max hard. Now, this is interesting because at the first set of pit stops, they had raced really hard, and then Max had dived into the pits. And in this one, George races really hard, then he dives into the pit, and there's been all these great Fast and Furious memes of them going off into the distance. Now, those two don't like each other, and you can tell on track, and it makes for spicy racing. A little bit of late movement, pushing it on the braking, both guys. Max doing what he always does, where he refuses to give up the position and will race around the outside. Even if, when you look at the driving rules, the inside car, which I would say, particularly on the last one, when Max hung it and pushed George back over, George was ahead at the apex as the overtaking car, and there is a point where the other car, under the rules, if the overtaking car has done enough, has to back out of the corner. Max never does that, and he'll never do it against George, and he'll force it. And it works for him. It does work for him. Anyway, that was very exciting. And what we then got to see was Lewis Hamilton managed to get the pass on Max Verstappen finally and find himself in that third position spot. Meanwhile, Kimi Antonelli, as I say, is closing on Charles Leclerc, but he gets his big issue. after George Russell had the right rear puncture and had to go back, and it felt like his race was over. At that point, it felt like, God, he's just not getting his luck. Kimi Antonelli, running wide on the curb, gets the front left windshield issue. He very admirably battles through the race to try and get points, but he ultimately takes a penalty for too many track limits infringements. Now, lots of drivers have criticised this, and I think particularly when you are battling the issue in the moment and you are losing time, the track limits shouldn't apply. As long as you're making a concerted effort to make corners or get around the track, and there could be some discretion in there. What I think is a bit different, though, is when he came out to try and hold on to the position and they're making a conscious decision to race with a defective car and he starts missing corners, at that point, I'm not so bothered about track limits being applied because your car's defective, you've got to drive within the car. So I wasn't hugely sympathetic on that front, but I think in the moment when something goes wrong on the car and the driver then needs time to get it back in the pits for it to be seen to, I am very sympathetic and don't think there should be track limits. If you come back out and you've got an issue, I think maybe it's fair dues that you're getting track limits because we want to see cars racing properly. Anyway, it looks like the race order's finished. It's going to be Charles Leclerc. It's going to be Lewis Hamilton. But Max Verstappen's Macarena flippy wing doesn't close the end of the straight and he spins out and crashes and causes the safety car 4 laps before the end. Flashback to Abu Dhabi 2021. Is there enough time to get the unlapped cars out of the way? Ferrari make a decision to pit Lewis Hamilton. At the time, it felt 4 laps before the end, it was a big crash. It didn't feel like it was going to happen. There were significant lap cars. And they came out and it was 0.2 seconds behind George Russell on the pit exit. And listen, it's easier for Mercedes to just pit opposite Ferrari at that point. Maybe in hindsight, you can only say that Ferrari dropped the ball there and lost points in a very close championship battle against the championship rival. Ultimately, it didn't matter for Charles Leclerc. Now, what can we do about this at the end of the race? In IndyCar, lapped cars are forced to go through the pit lane and rejoin at the back of the grid. And it stops this whole having to shoot out in front and gain enough of a gap. And it clearly isn't working. Now, listen, it's very, very rare that a race finishes under safety car conditions. You could also red flag it. I'm not a huge fan of red flagging it for the sake of it, when other instances wouldn't be a red flag just because it's the end. I'm not a fan of standing starts at the end of a race either. I think the drivers have earned enough to be in the positions they are at that point. So if you're going to have the safety car start, which does give you a moving start, not as exciting, but more reflective, particularly at the end of a race. And if you've got drivers that maybe have pitted onto softer tyres, you'll get to see that play out. Let's not waste the time unlapping lap cars. I think we should do what we do in IndyCar, and they should go through the pit lane and rejoin at the back of the pack. That's the race, but let's talk about the key themes. Now let's start with the easy one, Aston Martin. Okay, Fernando Alonso didn't make it to start the grid, went straight in the pit lane. Lance Stroll took yet more track limits infringements. He picks them up for fun. Miserable time. Haas, they're on the back foot, they're dropping down. Williams, Alex Albon is not having a fun season. Carlos Sainz is occasionally putting in performances, but none of them are enough to get them consistent points. And the real juicy battle is Racing Bulls versus Alpine. Alpine are 5 points ahead now, but Racing Bulls have really shown themselves to be the strongest midfield team, like I said last time, and they were even getting close to Hadjar, relatively speaking, compared to previous races. Now, Audi, you say Bortoleto would be happy. He had a pretty good weekend, and he managed to battle for 8th. Huge. And this Formula 1.5 is really quite exciting. Now, at the front, Red Bull, they've got a very unhappy Max Verstappen. Is their car as bad as they say it is? It seems to be pretty quick, but it's clearly unbalanced. He's clearly not happy, and there's all sorts of rumours in the Max camp. These exit clauses, and there's some unhappiness with these regulations. But the cars are what they are, and they're going to be that way with tweaks for the next 3 years. It's still very quick racing. They've got to get used to them. They've got to design a good car. The crash for Max wasn't his fault. The rear ring didn't flip back round. There's maybe some safety investigations looking at that because there's been a couple of failures on that Red Bull recently. So is it safe to race in? Mercedes going to be happy with their driver's performance. There was an interesting clapback from Toto Wolff when George Russell at the end of the race tried to question the straight line speed, and straight away he said there's nothing wrong with the straight line speed, and I think putting it more on George to look at his own performance, because George was a bit lucky in that race. You can't say anything, but he had points coming, but Kimi Antonelli would have finished ahead of him, and Kimi Antonelli would likely have won the race when you look at how easily he passed Lewis and how he was closing on Leclerc. So Mercedes dropping points through reliability, but their drivers are going strong. Kimi Antonelli's definitely got the upper hand, But George Russell needs to find something. Now, it's still early season. Last year, of course, we had Lando in the back for a lot of it, and he ultimately came through to win the championship, and people writing him off. Maybe we'll see with George. Maybe the pressure will make him or it will break him, and we will see. Ferrari, I think, are going to be happy. I think their one issue is going to be performance. They still are finding themselves behind despite the upgrades, and it's really in the engine. I think we've got Ferrari with probably the slightly better drivers. Lewis is on great form, but Kimi Antonelli is putting in great performances. But is it slightly more the car? It's hard to tell. They're all there. And what's going to make the difference is the cars themselves later on in the season and who can put in and who copes under pressure. McLaren, not the most brilliant day for them. Early season where it did feel like there was potentially a swapping and changing of who is in the second spot. That seems to be put to bed. This championship is a Mercedes and a Ferrari one, certainly. So, Marshals, I think we've covered an awful lot there, and that wraps up very nicely the British Grand Prix. I will catch you next time.